Okay, are we able to hear me now? If you can hear me, please type in the question box and let me know that you can hear me. Yes. Oh, thank you. My goodness. Perfect. I am so sorry about that. I don't know what was happening, and then I was fiddling around with the audio and it just kicked me out of the whole program. Okay, we're going to start all over. So I apologize for that. Okay, I'm going to give everybody a couple minutes to rejoin the webinar because I know everyone got kicked off when it kicked me off because I'm the host. So I'm going to give everybody a couple seconds to log back in, and then we'll get started now that y'all can hear me. Again, I apologize for the difficulties. That has never happened to me before. It just kind of kicked me out and wasn't recognizing any of my audio attachments. So I apologize. So I'll give everybody a couple minutes here, and then I'll get started again. All right, it looks like a lot of us has joined back. We have almost the same attendee count as before. So again, I apologize for that. So we will go ahead and get started officially. All right, so starting over, please remember that these webinars are intended for educational purposes only. And while we do hope that you learn new information, the trainers that present these webinars are not attorneys. Therefore, all information provided during the presentation and the Q&A session should not be construed as legal advice. All right, take two. We are in the second installment today of our Understanding Your Employee Handbook Part 2. In Part 1, remember we talked about the legally required policies. Today we are going to talk about the recommended policies, but we're also going to talk about your employer obligations regarding your handbook, just to make sure that you understand exactly what you're supposed to do with your handbook and what you are legally obligated to enforce. So just kind of a brief overview of our agenda today. We are going to talk about, again, like I said, those employer policy enforcement obligations. Then we're going to talk about quite a few recommended policies. This list is not all inclusive, but we're going to cover quite a few of the top policies that I recommend in every handbook. And then we will finish off with a Q&A for anyone that has questions. All right, so just as a recap, I want you all to remember from last week that remember, employee handbooks are not legally required. I want to reiterate that for anybody who wasn't part of the recording last week. Employee handbooks are not legally required, but they do serve as extra protection, and you should highly consider having one implemented for your company. Now, we're going to talk a lot about what kind of recommended policies you can put in place to add to those protections based on your type of company, your industry, or maybe just your work environment. Now, remember that if you choose not to have an employee handbook, you still have to follow all of the required employment laws that would be included in the employee handbook. But we are assuming again today that you do have a handbook in place, or it is your intention to put a handbook in place. So we're not going to be talking about obligations if you don't have a handbook. Also remember that if you do have a handbook, you must include all legally required policies on both the federal and state level, and you are required to follow the policies you have in your handbook. Those are your two legal obligations if you have a handbook in place. All right, that being said, let's talk about the policy practice obligations. So if you have an employee handbook implemented at your company, you are legally required to follow all of the policies in your handbook as they are written, meaning that you can absolutely get into trouble for not following your policies. So, for example, if your handbook says that you pay out accrued PTO upon employment separation, but you decide that an employee should not get their PTO paid out because they did not provide, let's say, a full 2 weeks notice like you require, then that employee can file a complaint with the Department of Labor and trigger a Department of Labor investigation into all of your pay practices, not just your PTO. And just because they complained about your PTO doesn't mean that the Department of Labor won't investigate the rest of your pay practices and possibly find something that you might be doing wrong. It becomes a very slippery slope. So practicing your policies and reviewing them annually can mitigate any risk that you might have of getting a claim or a claim filed against you. Now, when you update your handbook annually, you should look for a couple of things. You should look for state law changes that affect handbook notice requirements, And we do an annual state legislative law update at the end of every year. We usually do a 5 or 6 part series and we break the states up into regions. So if you are a multi-state employer, I highly recommend you look out for that webinar series. We usually do it in November or December. You also want to look for any outdated policies that you no longer practice. So that way you can either remove them or update them. You want to look at any policies that need to be updated, either because your practices have changed, your hierarchy has changed, maybe your leadership has changed and they want to focus on a different type of practice. You need to review any policies that you are not practicing word for word, so that way you can update them to avoid any mitigated risk. Now, the first recommended policy we are going to talk about today that I always like to have is an introductory period policy. Now, some employers call this a probationary period, but we've actually moved away from that language because it has a negative connotation to it. Essentially, the introductory period is a set amount of time, usually about 90 days, where an employee is getting their feet wet with the company. This new employee will be familiarizing themselves with their role, their team, their manager, and any tasks involved in their position. Now, a lot of employers assume that the introductory period is a time when they can exercise their at-will doctrine at any time during the 90 days. And if you remember from last week, we talked specifically about why the at-will doctrine isn't exactly what a lot of employers want it to be. However, this is not the case. Remember, like I said from last week, that there's always some level of liability with any termination, regardless of when it happens. This includes during an employee's first 90 days. Employers can't just fire an employee in the first 90 days without good reason. There still needs to be some level of documentation and expectations set. So what exactly does the introductory policy do for you? The introductory policy outlines the expectations of the first 90 days of employment, notifies the employee that their performance will be monitored during this time, and a completion of the 90-day period does not guarantee continued employment. That last bullet is important because a lot of employers use language that separates the intro period from the rest of employment. And remember again, last week we talked about implied contracts, and this language can create an implied contract if you're not careful. So this policy helps to negate any implied contract language that you might use elsewhere. The next recommended policy is employment of relatives. Now, this is a unique policy that I tend to get a lot of pushback from when I recommend it. Now, we're going to talk about the employment of relatives policy and exactly why I recommend it, as well as why I think employers should consider it. I realize that many small to medium-sized businesses tend to be family-owned, and by extension, they tend to hire a lot of relatives into the business. However, studies have actually shown us that family-owned businesses are taken advantage of more by family members than by non-relational employees. This is why I recommend that a lot of family-owned businesses have some basic guidelines in place surrounding hiring additional family members into the company. Now, these guidelines can be customized to your unique business needs and structure, because remember, this is one of those laws that is not regulated federally or at the state level. Now, family members should not manage each other. That is one of the basic guidelines that I always recommend including in this policy. Now, one of the arguments I get is when a husband and a wife are owners of the company, I know they tend to hire a family member, and they may hire a family member as a senior level leader. And they'll probably manage them directly, but it would be better off to put some levels of management in between the owners and any family members that they hire, so other employees are in between the reporting structure. Now, a second guideline should be that family members will not be placed into a role that creates a conflict of interest. If you're a family-owned business, please do not put your family members in a position like human resources or payroll. This creates a massive conflict of interest because HR and payroll is a controlling position that affects both family and non-family employees. So you want this person to be impartial and able to represent all the employees equally in their duties. Now, the main reason that this policy is highly recommended is that any perception of favoritism due to family relation in your company can drastically decrease employee morale and increase your turnover, which we know is very costly, especially to small organizations. Again, this policy can be adapted to fit your company's structure and needs, but I highly recommend all companies have something written down and some kind of stance on this potential issue, because having a policy shows good faith effort to non-family employees that you understand that there is a potential for a conflict of interest or even favoritism, and that you're putting barriers in place to prevent that as much as possible. So it's showing your non-family employees that you're looking out and you're making sure that the scales are not tipped against them. The next policy we're going to talk about is the complaint procedure notice. Now, a lot of employers assume that having something called an open door policy is the same as a complaint procedure policy, and that is not the case. An open door policy encourages employees to be open about concerns that they have for the company. A complaint procedure gives the employees a specific avenue and process to follow when they feel the need to file a complaint. And by including it in the handbook, they now have the autonomy to look up the process and follow it themselves, rather than being forced to ask a manager or HR and have someone know that they are intending to file a complaint. Now, some of you might be thinking, why do I want employees to know the process to complain about a manager or employee or even my company? Well, employees have a right to file a complaint with the Department of Labor, OSHA, the EEOC, or even a private attorney without ever bringing the issue to your attention. And if you don't have a procedure, that's exactly what they'll do. So having a process in place ensures that you can handle any complaints internally first and mitigate your risk of a formal claim by a government agency or even a private lawsuit. Another important policy, kind of tagging along with that, is to have a clearly outlined progressive corrective action or disciplinary plan. Now, this policy is going to outline how performance or behavior-based issues will be addressed in the company. However, it does not outline what performance or behavior issues will be disciplined. You don't want to have a complete list of all the possible behaviors or issues that could cause discipline. The reason you don't want this list is that you'll never be able to create a comprehensive enough list. So what happens if an employee elicits a behavior or has a performance issue that you forgot to put on the list? Well, then technically you can't discipline for it if you have a list that says this is what you're disciplined for. Because of that, we want to make sure that the policy is clearly outlined as to what the progressive disciplinary steps are, but you want to be ambiguous enough to allow for what we call discretionary decision making amongst your managers. Having that balance in your policy is truly the best way to protect your organization while still allowing for some accountability. Timekeeping and overtime are some exceptionally important policies that I highly recommend you have in your handbook. These policies go hand in hand with attendance and tardiness, which we're going to talk about on the next slide. But these policies should outline expectations regarding employees clocking in and out, meal and rest breaks, and placing guidelines on when overtime is appropriate. These expectations are important to document because attendance, tardiness, and overtime are some of the most disciplined behaviors in organizations. Therefore, it's important that the expectations are clear to your employees. This helps mitigate your risk when you're writing up employees for any timekeeping related issues. Also, keep in mind, if you are a multi-state employer, different states have different definitions of timekeeping and overtime allowances. So make sure that if you are a multi-state employer and you have two different states that differ vastly in either their overtime calculation or their timekeeping, that you make sure that you have state separated policies. Now, again, on that note, like I said, we're going to talk about attendance and tardiness because they go hand in hand. So attendance and tardiness are policies that closely relate to and stem from timekeeping and overtime. So for example, an employee can't know whether or not they're going to be counted as tardy unless they have a clear guideline set up for them regarding clocking in and out. When I worked at Disneyland in college, they allowed a 5-minute buffer for clocking in after your scheduled clock-in time. And they dictated where in the park you could clock in because there were a lot of clocking stations all over Disneyland and Disney California Adventure. So if I clocked in at 5:05 for my scheduled shift, I would have 10 minutes of travel time to walk from my clock station put my stuff in a site locker, and report to my manager to start work. Again, those specifications were outlined because of the way Disney is structured, and they had to account for how enormous the work environment was for us in order to travel from the parking lot to one side of the park all the way to our location in the park. So if I clocked in at 5:06 or I reported to my manager past the 10-minute travel time, I would be considered tardy. If Disney had not put that in the handbook, there would be no way to hold me accountable for expectations if I was tardy if they didn't let me know exactly what is considered a tardy. Now, the main reason that these policies are so important and need to be updated regularly is because you can't hold employees accountable to expectations that were not communicated to them in multiple ways. Keyword there being multiple. The handbook is a great reference tool for these expectations, but that can't be the only place the employees see them. These expectations, especially pertaining to attendance and tardiness, should also be communicated to them in the handbook, verbally from their managers, during their onboarding process, and on an ongoing basis. Managers should always be reiterating key policies to employees during department meetings or performance conversations, especially if there's a specific issue with attendance happening across the company or even in a specific department. Another thing to keep in mind is that some states have guidelines on tracking sick days and have mandatory attendance policy statements that have to be included in your handbook if you choose to have one. Sick days can't be counted against attendance in some states, so this is important to know when reviewing your handbook. Are you compliant with your state's sick leave and attendance requirements? If you don't know or you're not sure, you may want to look it up because a lot of states are starting to add this into their required legal policies. Another really good policy to have, and a lot of us don't tend to think about this policy, is an inclement weather policy. Now, these types of policies outline what will happen in the event of a severe weather event in your area, an emergency closing of your business, or any other related closing. This policy provides employees details on procedures surrounding an emergency closing, how they're going to be paid in the event of a closing, and what happens if they choose not to report to work if you decide to stay open, and who can issue a designated emergency closing. This is all important information and may vary from region to region. For example, in California, this policy may include language about earthquakes and fire evacuations on a city or county level, versus in the Northeast, they'll probably talk more about snowstorms and electrical outages and even hurricanes. Overall, this policy provides information to employees so they can be prepared to handle any inclement weather or emergency closing issued by the company. And now that we've all experienced a global pandemic, I recommend including in there some basic steps if, for whatever reason, we have to go through a pandemic again. Think back to how you handled it when the country shut down. How did you notify your employees? How did you pay them for the first couple of days? How did you handle that situation? Try to put it into a general guideline policy so that employees are prepared if it happens again in the future. A newer recommended policy that we are seeing pop up is a telecommuting or telework policy. These policies outline any expectations for employees that are permitted to telework and under what circumstances they are able to do so. Additionally, these policies should have clear guidelines for eligibility if you're not going to allow all employees to telework or if some positions are not able to telework. These types of work arrangements should get manager approval, and if you are not 100% remote work environment, then teleworking is technically a benefit, and the policy should be constructed as a benefit and not part of the employment agreement, meaning that you can take away their teleworking privileges at any time if it affects their attendance or performance. Now, these types of policies are crucial to helping navigate the increasing requests for work from home or flex time. I was just at a seminar where the vice president of HR at Cinemark stated that they're actually getting candidates who turn down offers to work for their home office in their corporate office in Dallas because they currently lack a defined and documented work from home policy. They want the option to work from home sometime. They've gotten used to it over COVID. COVID-19 really spoiled the workforce, and those who like working from home are going to ask for it at some point in their interview. It's important for employers to be prepared to answer this question and to know what policy they have in place. Another thing to consider is that we're seeing a lot of these telecommuting requests as an accommodation for under ADA or as an accommodation under a leave of absence. So let's say they come back from FMLA, but they can't come back full time, but their doctor is approving them for half time. They're requesting that they can work from home. Or women who are getting ready to have a baby, they may be on bed rest, but they may be able to work from home. Those are also requests that you may have to consider if your company can allow them to work remote. How are you going to handle those requests? Now, this policy is a popular one, and a lot of companies already have this policy in their handbook, but 9 times out of 10, when I see this in a handbook, I have to do some serious revisions because of legal compliance. So, outside employment and moonlighting is a policy that should outline the employer request of employees who hold multiple jobs at the same time. Now, these policies are really purpose with helping the company to avoid conflict of interest. That's the sole purpose. However, the policies are not always written that way. So here are some red flags to avoid in this policy. If you have any of this type of language that I'm going to tell you in your existing policy, it needs to be rewritten to keep your liability low. So you cannot outline in the policy that your company must approve an employee getting a second job. As an employer, you have to be very careful about any policies that cross the line of your rights as an employer. You can legally control the employee's time when you're paying them for that time, but you cannot control what an employee does on their own time, and getting a second job is their own time. You can request that they let you know if they get a second job, but you cannot require it, and you cannot tell them that you have to approve it. You also cannot require an employee to tell you about a second job that they already hold or that they're going to get. So again, you can request that they inform you if they decide to get a second job, but you can't require it. You can, however, put language on there that a second job should not affect the availability for shift work or for hours or anything like that at your company. Otherwise, it may affect their scheduled hours and possibly their employment. And finally, you cannot discipline an employee for having a second job unless you can prove it is affecting their work performance at your job. Remember that the burden of proof is always on the employer, so if you don't have documentation that the performance issues are definitely caused by them having a second job, you can't include that in any of your disciplinary documentation. Having this policy definitely helps to outline your basic expectations, and some employees may see the policy and decide that getting a second job may not be worth risking their hours or their shift. So it's good to have as a possible deterrent, if nothing else. And finally, we're going to talk about one other policy that most companies have done away with nowadays, but that still pops up from time to time. So it's recommended that employers have a clear policy in the handbook that states that the company does not provide advances or loans to any employee for any reason. This was an older practice, especially found in smaller family-owned businesses. However, as the legal terrain has developed in the last decade, these types of practices put a bunch of financial liability on the employer with absolutely no benefits. A lot of employers say to me, well, if they leave the company and they still owe me money, I'm just going to deduct it from their final paycheck. Again, this was a practice that used to be acceptable, but it's not legal. Employers cannot deduct an employee's wages for any reason unless they have a signed authorization form from the employee stating that they authorize that specific deduction for that specific amount. The law has become very strict on employers' ability to touch an employee's payroll. So by allowing for advances or loans, you have to be prepared to eat that cost if the employee decides to leave and never pay it back. Again, it's not worth the headache. Having this policy in the handbook gives managers a document to speak to when or if the employee asks about it. Now it doesn't come off as, no, we won't do that for you. Now it's going to be interpreted as the company policy doesn't allow us to do that, period. This helps to salvage employee and manager relations. It also helps to avoid the awkward money conversations where employees divulge their entire, possibly irresponsible spending history to their managers to try to persuade them to help, as well as the ethical conundrum that it puts your managers in if any of the loan or advances are needed for less than legal reasons. And overall, it just helps employers stay out of their employees' personal financial affairs. You provide them a paycheck for their hours worked. If they have personal financial struggles, you can always point them in the direction of EAP or a financial counselor or resource. but employers should never try to help or get involved in an employee's finances. All right, so those are some of the top recommended policies that I recommend having in your handbook. If you don't have some of those policies in your handbook and you would like them in your handbook, or you definitely need to revise them because you may have some of the language I cautioned against, you're more than welcome to reach out to myself or Kathy. We are always reviewing handbooks. You can send us over an inquiry and we'll get you an exact quote on what it would cost to do your handbook. But that is basically the recommended policies, or the top recommended policies that we see all the time and that we get a lot of questions on. Just remember that the handbook is a vessel of communication with your employees, and you truly get out of it what you literally put into it. Employees should want to use it as a tool for information pertaining to their employment. So you want to make sure that you get the added benefit of lower liability because you have the documents in place. Now, if anyone has any questions, feel free to type them into the question box now and I'll answer them in just a second. But remember, as a reminder, this presentation was recorded and you can view it on our website. I have also uploaded the handouts into the handout section, so you should be able to download the slides for this presentation. I know we were having an issue with GoToWebinar sending out the copy of the slides with the follow-up emails. For some odd reason, they stopped sending out PDF attachments, so I've included it here in the handout section here. And again, you will be able to view the recording of this webinar on our website. There's also a survey that follows up this webinar, so feel free to leave feedback and let us know if there's any other topics you would like us to talk about in 2021. We are almost done with our schedule. I think we're through October, but we still have a couple slots open for topic suggestions in November and December, so let us know if there's something that you want to hear. All right, let me see what questions we have. Can you write in the policy handbook no moonlighting? No, you cannot forbid an employee from having a second job. You can't tell them that they can't have a second job. Or moonlighting is another term for it, specifically in construction. Now, typically in construction is a little bit of its own animal. And moonlighting sometimes has multiple meanings. So in construction, you can tell your employees that they are not permitted to use company equipment. So if you provide their tools, or if you provide the materials, let's say you're a tile installer and you provide the mortar and you provide the tile, they can't take those tools and that material and do side jobs or side work, because that's technically theft. However, if they want to work on the weekends and they want to do, their own renovation and they have their own tools, they can absolutely do that. They have the right to do that. And in a lot of states, it's actually unenforceable for you to do anything about it unless you can prove that they're using your materials or your tools. So no, I do not recommend forbidding a second job or moonlighting, because that does violate the employee's rights. Any other questions? All right, well, that is it for this week. Next week, we are going to be talking about, I think in part 3, we're going to be talking about benefits and state-specific leaves. I know quite a few of you had questions on benefits. So we are going to talk about what benefits to include in your handbook, which benefits vary from state to state, and we are going to talk a lot about state leaves as well as FMLA and ADA leaves of absences. So next week we are going to finish it off with leaves. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to me. My contact information is on this last slide. I did not change the join us next week title, so I apologize. But my contact information is on this slide if you have any questions or if you would like to get a quote on what it would cost to do your handbook. So I will see you guys all next week. You have a great rest of your week and enjoy your weekend.